Greetings. It's Tuesday, May the 12th, 2026, and this is the Daily Article Podcast from Denison Forum. I'm narrator Chris Elkins, giving voice to today's daily article authored by friend and scholar Dr. Jim Denison. Late Monday afternoon, the U.S. Supreme Court cleared the way for Alabama to use a new congressional map ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. The High Court set aside lower court rulings that had blocked the state from using the GOP-drawn map, which would eliminate one of the state's two majority black districts. The ruling followed the court's April 29th decision in a similar case from Louisiana. Apart from the court's ruling in Dobbs that returned abortion legislation to the states, I cannot think of a decision in recent years that have been more interpreted in more disparate ways. For example, the Wall Street Journal editorial board hailed the April 29th ruling as a victory for voting rights. In their view, the decision, quote, took a large step toward ending the partisan abuse of race to carve up congressional districts in a way that violates the Constitution, end quote. The New York Times editorial board, by contrast, claimed that, quote, the justices acted as partisans in their ruling. In their view, in the name of disentangling race from politics, the Supreme Court has given white voters more power at the expense of racial minorities, end quote. My purpose today is not to explore the legal intricacies of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the landmark federal statute that outlawed racial discrimination in voting, or its application to congressional maps over the decades. Rather, it is to take a step back and consider our response to this news on a more visceral level. I'll begin by restating a truth I've proclaimed many times over the decades of public ministry. Racism is a sin. In my extensive article, What Does the Bible Say About Racism?, a link to which is in today's podcast episode notes, I analyze racism in American history and today, then discuss slavery in the Bible, racism in the Bible, 3 common questions on the subject, and practical ways we can advance God's unconditional love through our personal and public lives. To the degree that congressional maps promote racial discrimination, they violate the biblical declaration in Romans 2, verse 11, that God shows no partiality. However, the matter is not as simple as it might appear. To some, congressional maps drawn to heighten representation by racial minorities are a necessary response to systemic racism in our country. To others, when such maps are drawn to advance racial agendas, they are themselves racist. Voting maps should not advantage or disadvantage any of America's citizens. Political, legal, and cultural leaders have been debating this issue for half a century, however, with no resolution in sight. You and I could join the debate today however we wish. What we cannot do is see it through eyes other than our own. I am writing this article as a white male who has faced no racial discrimination in my 67 years of life. I have no idea what it's like to be followed around in a pharmacy by employees making sure I'm not stealing from their shelves. I have no idea what it's like for my teenage daughter to knock on a neighbor's door selling tickets to her school play only to have the homeowner call the police on her. I have no idea what it's like to enter a jewelry store with my wife only for employees to usher us to the less expensive merchandise in the belief that's all we can afford. But one of my dearest friends knows just what all of that is like because it happened to him for the simple reason that his skin color is black. I don't know how he feels about congressional maps because we've never discussed the subject. But whatever his views, I know they come from a world of experiences different from mine in ways that should not be, but are. The closest I have come to approximating his experience has been my travels to China, Russia, and Cuba, where I was viewed suspiciously as an American by people who assumed they knew me because they knew my nationality. I do not understand what it's like to feel insecure in a dark parking lot because of my gender, or at risk in a retirement home because of my age, or in severe danger in a foreign land because of my faith. As a result, it is vital that I write, speak, and otherwise respond to cultural issues in ways that offer biblical truth with personal humility. What God says is what matters, not what I think. And what I think comes from a finite, fallen mind couched in experiences that limit my perspective and understanding. Given the existential difference that exists in a culture as disparate as ours, can we find hope beyond humility and unity beyond tolerance? Consider the Jerusalem church from Acts 2, verses 9 through 11, consisting of people from 15 different language groups scattered across the Roman Empire. According to Acts 2, verses 42 and 44, when they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayers, as a consequence, all who believed were together and had all things in common. This miracle wasn't just a matter of spiritual location, moving closer to the Lord and thus closer to each other. It was also a matter of spiritual transformation as Jesus changed their hearts so they came to love each other as they loved themselves, referenced in John 13, verses 34 and 35. Since love is a fruit of the Spirit, available to all who surrender and humble themselves before Him, noted in Ephesians 5:18 and Galatians 5, verse 22, you and I can love everyone Jesus loves, and He loves everyone. The Scottish evangelist Henry Drummond wrote, God, the eternal God, is love. Covet, therefore, that everlasting gift, that one thing which it is certain is going to stand, that one coinage which will be current in the universe when all the other coinages of all the nations of the world shall be useless and unhonored. End quote. What coinage will you covet today? You didn't expect it to shake you this much. Maybe it was the diagnosis. Maybe it was the funeral. Maybe it was the prayer that went unanswered. You believe in God. You always have. But lately, you find yourself wondering, why did He allow this? Why didn't He intervene? Can I really trust Him? The world has answers. Everything happens for a reason. Just have more faith. Don't ask questions. But none of those bring peace, because deep down, you don't need cliches. You need clarity. You need truth strong enough to hold your questions. That's why we re-released Dr. Jim Denison's new edition of Wrestling with God. In this honest and personal book, Jim tackles the hardest questions Christians can carry, but rarely say out loud. Questions about suffering, about doubt, about prayer, about whether we can truly trust the God we serve, not with shallow reassurance, but with biblical depth and thoughtful conviction. Because wrestling with God is not the end of faith, it's often where deeper trust begins. If you have ever struggled to reconcile what you believe with what you've experienced, this book is for you. Visit supportdf.org to get your copy today. That's support, the letter D, the letter F.org. A link is in today's episode notes. Get your copy today and learn to wrestle honestly and trust God more deeply.